It's surreal for me to be up here filling in for Kelly today because it was almost to the day 27 years ago that we had our first worship services at Vanguard, and I happen to be one of the people that was involved in that. Myself and 2 or 3 others, along with Tasha and Kelly, about 9 months before that, had started some small groups and others and imagined what would Vanguard be. And then about this time of the year, 27 years ago, we started Vanguard Church. And if you go to your website, right, right here, now this is a small, I said in the first, like, this is what photos looked like in the 1900s. So it's a little too small. But if you go to your own website, here's it all began. And in the back corner of that picture is a guy that's just shredding on the axe, right? It's that's me. Next to him is Brian Beatty. I don't know if you guys, any of you remember or know Brian Beatty for a while. And then up front, on the far left, you can see leading on lead vocals and keys is Tasha Williams. This is one of our first services that we had, and I was there for quite a bit of the history of our church, ranging anywhere from being a lay leader early on to I was an associate pastor. I was the pastor of students for quite a number of years. And, the students around here, right? Yeah, okay, good. Oh, right, well, front. Okay, I'm going to spit on you. I'm going to bless you by spitting on you. And saying things like, I'm a Stan, or like madcap. No? Okay, all right. My daughter tells me I get it wrong all the time. So I've known a handful of you for a number of years, some of you not at all. So I thought my last day on staff at Vanguard was actually, I remember it clearly, January 1st, 2006. And the reason I remember that is because we were swapping pastoral responsibilities over the holidays, and I was kind of like, a curmudgeon saying, like, we're really going to have worship service on New Year's Day, on Sunday. And Kelly was like, yes. And so I led worship on New Year's Day, January 1st, 2006, and then went on. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll give you the last 20 years in 20 seconds, just so you know kind of what I've done and how much Vanguard has shaped me over that time. So I left that day, January 1st, and from there went and actually got a PhD in theology and culture, so cultural studies and theology. And because I'm a super nerd, a number of years later, I got a second PhD in psychological science. And so you're like, what in the world is any of that? Basically now I work as a professor at Fuller Seminary, and I teach and I research and study basically the ways that we interact with culture as Christians and both the theological and sort of psychological implications of that. Okay. That's my day job, right? But the really important thing that has happened in the last 20 years is I have this family I want to tell you about. There's me, my wife, Jessica. She's the best of us all. Makes everything work well. And my oldest daughter, Callie, there on the right. Then Maddie on the left-hand side, and then her youngest, Maeve. So they're 13, 11, and 8, all of a sudden. They were non-existent. It seemed like a blink of an eye ago, and here they are. I don't know about you, but it's probably because of having kids and at the age that they're at. But at a certain point, I was doing all this kind of like research and writing and wrote a bunch of books on, engaging culture theologically, blah, 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 and nobody read them. In fact, I joke, I thought, people think you write books and like, oh, that's a big deal. Not actually a big deal. I have, I think, 7 books I've written, and I have still yet to make a dime off of those. In fact, I thought I hit rock bottom when I got my statement saying 1 quarter, you've sold 0 copies. And I was like, well, all right, that's one of my older titles. Okay, nobody's buying them. But I was wrong. The next quarter, I got a statement. And I have successfully sold -1 copies of a book before. And so I was like, okay, so I'm doing this work. I'm thinking it's important. I'm hoping people, respond to it. And they aren't. So what should I do? And recently I thought, well, maybe what I could do is imagine sort of my work as a theologian, as a professor. What if I did this stuff? What if I interacted with who God is and what God has for us and how God has called us in the world? And what if I wrote it and formed it in a way that my kids could understand, that my kids would find compelling? Because if they can't, if all the stuff I do in the rest of my life doesn't track with them, then why in the world am I doing it? And so I thought, well, why don't I write kids' illustrated books? So I started writing some kids' illustrated books. Here's one of our most recent ones, and it's called The Cactus and Armadillo. Available on Amazon or anywhere fine books are sold, if you would like a copy. I'm kidding, I don't go by the book. It's actually quite lovely, though, if you want to read it. If you find yourself to be potentially a kind of a person that closes up and it's hard to make friends, or maybe you find yourself kind of a prickly personality and have difficulty making friends, this book is for you, right? I wrote it, and then I storyboard these books, but actually my older sister and younger brother do all the illustrations for them. They are like ridiculous visual artists. My sister actually is illustrator for a number of different books. My brother's an art director for video games. If any of you have ever played God of War, any of the people? Yeah, okay. So he did all the God of War characters, Miss Caton. So he's like these ridiculously talented artists, and I'm not them, but I'd like to think that I have a little bit of it in my blood, right? So I often, with my kids, we will do this thing called the 3 crayon challenge. And what you do is you blindfold, put your hand in a bag, grab 3 crayons, and then you have a minute to draw something, right? And we were doing this one time, and I produced what I'm pretty sure, humans like 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now will look back, and they will think of this time as the time before this artwork was produced and the time after it was produced. All of history will be cut in half by this piece, and I can only describe it as an exploration of the strictures of manhood in a late modern society. Or, as my oldest daughter said when she saw it, is that a guy with a mustache? I present to you, guy with mustache, crayon on paper, the brilliance of which you're going to see in just a minute. There it is. I know. I think applause is right for that. That's the right response. I understand. My work is avant-garde. It's progressive. It's not for the mainstream audience. But here it is, this breathtaking vision. Unfortunately, my second didn't quite agree. When she saw it, her response was, I don't see it. And I was like, what do you mean you don't see it? And she's like, the guy with the mustache, I don't see it. And I was like, it's right here. Like, it's clearly, here's his eyes. I started saying it loudly and moving my hands. Here's his eyebrows. Here's his mustache. What do you mean you don't see it? She's like, I don't know. Maybe it's like some fried eggs and some pine trees. What? I don't see it, Dad. And, again, for you all to not understand my art, yeah, it's not for the masses, so that's fine. But for my own flesh and blood, to not get me and get my creative expression was just devastating. And so recognizing my failure as a father and as an artist, I just pushed the picture away. It spun around on the table and then landed in front of her upside down, kind of like this. Oh, it's a delay. There it is. And I did that in my frustration, and it landed in front of her, and then I heard her say, oh, there he is. It's a guy with a mustache. Dad, why didn't you just turn it upside down in the first place? So, for parents in the audience, I'm going to write a book one day, and it's going to be on parenting. And it's called Even the Best Parenting is Just Failing in Non-Catastrophic Ways. That's what I felt in this moment. What? Upside down, now you see it? I share that story because the reality is a certain set of pictures frame our entire view of reality, right? We have certain pictures, certain metaphors, certain stories that not only orient us towards the world, they frame certain things out of it, certain things in it. They also offer ways to interpret the world. And sometimes those pictures actually unite us, right? We share that sort of vision or picture of the world with other people. It brings us together. It allows us to commune and to connect. In other instances, those pictures actually divide us. They prevent us from seeing each other. They keep us from seeing the same thing that we're looking at and agreeing upon what it even is. Sometimes those pictures give us eyes to see. Sometimes those pictures blind us to our own blindnesses. And some people would say those pictures actually hold us captive. Now, it's interesting to me because often the way that we see the world it goes unnoticed by us, right? We're not even aware of how reality is being framed. But for the sake of God's kingdom, sometimes those pictures need to be turned on their head. I've always loved Vanguard in part because I think, at least the early days, and then as I've watched it grow from afar. I feel like, a dad now of Vanguard. But I've always loved Vanguard because I think it's been a community that's been willing to look at reality and say, what if it was otherwise? What if God's up to something different? What if the calling that Jesus has placed in our life actually asks us to flip the picture we've received on its head? A good example, years ago, so we have the VBB, decorations up. Years ago, there was a time that Christians in the United States really didn't like Harry Potter, okay? Now, I love Harry Potter. I'll share a Harry Potter story at some point, but that's off key. I was weeping at the end of book 7, right? And that's how old I am. I actually read the books before the movies were out. But Christians didn't love Harry Potter. And so you know what we did here at Vanguard? We had a Harry Potter vacation Bible blast. We're like, that'll be great, right? This thing that some people were saying was from the depths of hell, we flipped on its head and said, what if it's actually an opportunity for God to move in people's lives? Another thing I really loved at Vanguard is, I'm a musician, not great, but back in the early 90s, 2000s, there was sort of grunge and post-grunge, and so we often would bring in music, all sorts of kinds of music into our worship space, in part to interact with the sermon or worship, and I could list off the number of bands and songs that we played in this space or these spaces. Tool, Metallica, Pearl Jam, Smashing Pumpkins. It's pretty interesting to go, a band like Tool, I don't know if any of you know them, a band like Tool, we would perform a song of theirs in our worship space. That is an example of this church and this community looking at reality and saying, what if it's otherwise? What if I take the picture you have of this kind of music and turn it on its head? The interesting thing about that is, even though you might agree and say, yeah, sometimes it's good to look at things from a different perspective. Sometimes it's good to challenge sort of the status quo. It can be easier said than done. And the reason is because it's really unsettling at times. I'll share a fun story that I still think he would talk about. The one song we played by Smashing Pumpkins, we had this guy that was in a band that was sort of tour with the other band that I was a part of. And he came and did this performance that went down in sort of the annals of Vanguard history as the most inappropriate musical performance in a church setting ever. And so Kelly and I often still refer to that. So it didn't always go great, but it definitely always made you feel a little bit uncomfortable. And uncomfortable in a good way. Because when you have those pictures turned upside down, it is an uncomfortable scenario. Sometimes it's even, if you've ever had sort of like vision problems, if you've ever had devices to correct your vision put on, or if you get new glasses, it can even be nauseating, right? Like if the way that you see the world is messed with by yourself or someone else, it actually can induce a sense of like nausea. But here's what I think is amazing about this man, Jesus. When he comes into our lives and we confront him and we encounter him, the way that he turns the pictures that we have in mind on our head, it's something, the effect is something much deeper than simply I'm a little uncomfortable or I feel a little nauseous. It's more like what happens in the now classic film, The Matrix. Does anybody remember this movie? For the older people in the audience, that's a 25-year-old movie. It is celebrated 25 years. For the younger people in the audience, let me explain. The Matrix is this movie where John Wick has to go into the computer, and then the other character from John Wick, who's Lawrence Fishburne, comes and pulls him out of the computer, and then there's a lot of cool shooting. Okay, but if you remember that movie, and in fact, when we moved into these theaters, we started incorporating film into the sermons a lot. We did multiple sermons using The Matrix, right, as sort of sermon fodder. But if you remember that movie, there's this moment where Neo comes out of the Matrix, the first time he comes into the real world. Does anybody remember what it is that he first says? Anybody? Ha, good, no Matrix fans. What? Oh, yeah, you were in the first service. Why do my eyes hurt? And what's amazing to me, why I love that scene, he comes out of the Matrix and says, why do my eyes hurt? And Morpheus' response is, because you've never used them before. I think that's what Jesus does to us when he messes with our vision. In most of my life, the thing I learned on the ground, working here at Vanguard, being involved in the student ministry, preaching, leading worship, helping with VBBs, doing all the different things that we were doing as a community, I learned how to go and encounter this man, Jesus. And every time I do, he completely flips all of my assumptions on their head. Every single time. And all of my research, all of my scholarship, all the things I've done since I've gone from Vanguard have been nothing but an attempt on my part to communicate to other people as in every form, every fashion, any way that I can, how much my eyes hurt because of this man, Jesus. And the reason they hurt is because he reveals to me time and time and time again that it turns out I'm not even using them. So the question I want us to ask today, as we think about that, is how we understand our relationship to culture and how we think about these sort of flipped visions that Jesus gives us. So with that in mind, I want you to look in your Bibles, if you've got them, to Luke 14. It'll be on the screen or in your programs. And we're going to think about a moment in Jesus' life where he really flips the script. He does this sort of like guy with mustache move and completely turns on its head a really, I think, compelling vision that we've all got locked in mind. So look at Luke 14, 1 through 14. One Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully. And behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus responded to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. Then he took him and healed him and sent him away. And he said to them, "Which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day, will not immediately pull him out?" And they could not reply to these things. Now he told a parable to those who were invited when he noticed how they chose the places of honor, saying to them, "When you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, don't sit down in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, 'Give your place to this person.' And then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit in the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, 'Friend, move up higher.' Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." He said also to the man who had invited him, "When you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just." So here's just a little spoiler alert. This is a moment where Jesus actually turns a picture on its head that is captivating our imagination. And I say that because I'm going to also try to flip on its head a picture of the world that I think we all probably share on some level, and it might disturb you, okay? It might raise some questions. It's not going to be that disturbing, don't worry. But it might raise some questions, right? That's on purpose. I'm just going to prepare you. Here we go. It's partly because of passages like this that we talk a lot about Christian hospitality, right? What it means to be a faithful host of other people. And we're going to come back to these passages here in just a second and break that down. But it's really interesting to me, all the talk and the importance of Christian hospitality, that as Christians, and especially as disciples of this man Jesus, we claim to follow in the footsteps of a person who didn't ever host a thing. In his lifetime, Jesus didn't host anything. Think about it for a second. From his actual birth to his actual death, he came into the world and out of the world in land and in spaces that weren't his, based upon the charity and the hospitality of other people. Most of what we know in the Gospels is the adult Jesus. And in all of Jesus' ministry, he is a single itinerant preacher who's wandering the Judean countryside, relying on the hospitality of other people. Even if he wanted to be, Galilee's host with the most, he didn't have the resources to do it, right? But it's not just that he didn't have the resources. It's not just that, he was a poor itinerant preacher. At times, it seems like Jesus isn't even concerned with it. In fact, even resists it. If you think of the wedding at Cana, right? We often talk about Jesus' first miracle. His mom comes to him. They're throwing this wedding, this party. And she's like, we're out of wine, Jesus. Do something. And his response is, it's not my time. And I said in the first service the same thing. I think it's because I have adolescent children that when I quote Jesus, he sounds sometimes like my children to me in his tone. So I apologize for that. But can you imagine, I am the son and the grandson of Southern women who show Southern hospitality. And if my mom came to me and said, hey, I need your help with this party, and I said, my time hasn't arrived, we would have a serious sidebar conversation. But here's Jesus, right? It's not my time, mother. And then finally she convinces him to do it, and what does he do? He sort of is like, oh, all right, I'll do it. I'll make the wine, right? So he actively resists even when people invite him to host. And then he sort of begrudgingly gives in, right? It's a really interesting aspect of Jesus' life. But it's not just that. There are other moments where people come and actually ask Jesus to host, and he deflects to other people, usually the disciples. If you think about, there's multiple different scenes in the Gospels that are called the feeding of the 5,000 or the 4,000, right? And man, you get a bunch, I think, this is not, this is just an indictment on maybe men when they get together, but a bunch of 20 and 30-something men should not get together and form a hospitality company because it's every time they show up and they're totally surprised, well, I guess these 5,000 people are hungry. What are we going to do, Jesus? And what does Jesus say to them? He comes, they're hungry, and he's like, you figure it out. And then, of course, in their brilliance, the best idea they can come up with is steal a little kid's lunch. That's their approach to hospitality. So he'll resist it when his mom comes to it. He'll deflect at these other times. And then we see in this passage here, even when he's invited to a party, he's calling out the host for being a bad host. It's amazing the way that Jesus thinks about this. But his approach to all of these things doesn't mean that Jesus was against hospitality or anti-hospitality. It's rather that in his very sort of Jesus-y way of doing things, he took our picture, he took their picture of what hospitality is, and he turned it inside out and upside down. You see, Jesus didn't go and serve water to people. He went to the woman at the well and asked her to serve him water. Jesus didn't invite people over to his house. Jesus went to Zacchaeus and invited him over to his house. Jesus, didn't throw these extravagant parties for the tax collectors and sinners. He was invited and showed up to the parties of the tax collectors and sinners. And even when he's instructing his disciples to go out and spread the good news of God's kingdom, he didn't say, I want you to go and be these amazing hosts to all the people you encounter. He said, every city you go in, I want you to rely upon the hospitality that's given you. And if they don't show you hospitality, I want you to kick the dust of that town off your feet and get out of Dodge. I mean, this is a fascinating story about Jesus. So it's true, I think, in certain levels, that he wasn't a good or maybe even great host. But that's because Jesus was something altogether different. Jesus was hostable. His entire life, he practiced what it means to become the kind of person that other people want to invite into their most intimate of spaces. And so the question I just want us to think about as we look at this passage is, what if we did the same? What would that look like? And to answer that, I think we just need to kind of go through three levels of this passage. And as we do, I want you to ask three questions. One, where does Jesus go? Two, what does Jesus do? And then three, what does Jesus say? Pretty basic, right? But it's actually a good kind of lens of thinking through any of the Gospels and the narratives about Jesus. So where does Jesus go? Well, basically, Jesus goes anywhere he's invited. And I mean anywhere. I mean, he got a name for being friends with sinners because he was friends with sinners, right? That means he hung out with them in the places where they were. Jesus went anywhere, but he was intentional and strategic. This is the opposite of my general sensibility, which I often say, like, if you offer snacks, I'm showing up, right? Like, that's all you need to do. Are there snacks? Yep, okay, I'm there. If they're not, that's not very strategic, not very intentional. Jesus, very intentional about the invitations that he accepted. And he would go into places that were, here's some good, okay, this will reveal my Southern Baptist preaching. I was also ordained at Vanguard. This is where the church I was ordained in. Thank you. Yeah. And so, from the cradle, sort of, I grew up, my dad's a Southern Baptist pastor, and so you kind of get ordained in the womb, really. And so I think I came out of the womb with like 3-point alliteration. So I apologize for this, but where did Jesus go? He went in places that were public, plural, and polarized, right? We could also say porous, but that's just going overboard. Okay, that's too many P's. Public, this setting that he's invited to this leader of the Pharisees, right, in Luke 14, is a very public setting. It's not like we're imagining today the way we have our houses set up. You invite people over for this private meal. This meal is taking place kind of out in the marketplace, right? It's a very porous setting. People were coming and going. And the people that were there were very plural. It was a big mixture of socioeconomic, religious, and political different perspectives. So you have Pharisees and Sadducees. You have people, you have the Zealots. You have all the people that are sort of religious adherents, and they all have their own take on things, right? None of them agree. And then you have people who are sick and people who are well, people who are allowed to worship in the temple and people who aren't, people who are just doing business as usual, right? And then you have the passersby. You have this really interesting mix of people that means that it's not just public, but it's plural, right? It's a plural setting with all sorts of contrasting views on reality mixed in here. And mostly because of that, this context was incredibly polarized. Now, when I say Jesus entered public scenarios that were plural in terms of religious and political commitments, and that were because of that very polarized, does that sound familiar to you at all? To me, it describes 21st century North American society really well. There is one difference, though. I think we talk a lot about polarization right now, especially in politics and religion. And we can sometimes give ourselves the feeling that it's worse than it's ever been. And it's pretty bad, right? I don't think I'm saying anything new to say we live in a pretty polarized time. But the polarization that Jesus entered, and this is why the intentionality is amazing, the settings that he entered literally cost him his life. That kind of polarization is what killed Jesus. So as we think about how polarized our times are, and as we think about where are we going, the question we need to ask is, are we going into those spaces intentionally and with courage? What about you? Do you go into public, plural, polarized settings? And if your first instinct is to say, oh yeah, every single day I wake up, and before I do anything else, I get on social media, and I tell people what's what, and for the sake of the kingdom, I tell all the liars and the misinformed the truth, right? I do it in love, but I do it, right? It's important. If you're thinking of social media, please bracket that out of your mind. Right now, it's interesting that this is me just sort of opining here, right? This isn't like from God or anything like that. My thought is that one of the reasons that we have such a trouble right now in American society of talking about anything is largely because of social media. Jonathan Haidt has a new book, if you're interested, about an anxious generation, and he maps the levels of anxiety and depression and other stuff. Like, nothing changed in American society other than mobile phones. And when you introduce that into society, all of a sudden, everything goes off the charts. And it's like we don't have the capacity to actually be with other people who disagree with us without it just completely descending into chaos. And part of the reason is because we've been relying on this technology called social media as if it's a place that is actually public, plural, and polarized. But if you look into the actual technology itself, you know that it is only polarized. It is not public. It's also not plural. What do I mean? There are algorithms that send you a feed every day, every second, whatever it is, that is completely customized to you and you alone. Nobody else sees the world as you do through your Facebook page or your Twitter feed or your whatever it is. It's literally designed that way. It's giving you a picture of reality that is only yours. And what does that mean? That means a couple things. One, you only hear voices that either reinforce everything you already think and believe and do and buy. That's the main thing, actually. Or you hear the exact most extreme opposite. That's it. Everything else is scrubbed out. Why? Because that generates engagement. That either makes us feel very good, and we engage in those terms, or it enrages us. And that, my friends, is very profitable. So the entire thing is designed to polarize us, and it's keeping us from actually engaging in public discourse that is plural. It's a fascinating phenomenon. But what does Jesus do? He finds places that aren't just polarized, but places where he has to figure out a way to be in the space where people disagree. And he has to be in that space while still serving as a life-giving, redemptive, transformative presence. And that is really, really hard. And it comes with a whole lot of discomfort. Because I'll admit, I don't like sitting in spaces where, somebody's just going on and on about something that I think is just absurd, right? And biting my tongue and feeling like, is this the right? That's hard to do, right? Because, people are stupid, right? And it's hard to put up with stupid, right? None of you. It's just my friends, and I'm like, it's really hard, but it's even harder when we never have an opportunity to practice it, when we never live a life that's placing us into contexts that are actually plural, that are actually public. So the question is, where are those places for you? What does that look like for you? Where are you actually leaning into this? Because what happens when you do? What happens when you find those places is the same thing that happened to Jesus and I think the disciples. Over time, you develop this really interesting capacity to become comfortable with discomfort. And that's a hard pill to swallow, right? It doesn't mean find places where you will never, everyone's going to come to terms and we're going to all be comfortable and love each other. No, it's recognizing that most of our lives will be becoming comfortable with discomfort. And I don't claim that little phrase as my own. I actually stole it from the Peloton. Any Peloton users? If you don't know what the Peloton, it came up in COVID, right? My wife got one. It's basically this machine where millennials make you feel bad about yourself. That's how I describe it. But they also teach me these lovely phrases of becoming comfortable with discomfort. It's in terms of how you would train your physical body, right? I do some cycling, and it's the same sort of deal. A lot of times you'll talk in cycling, like, I'm going up this hill, it's really tough. When is it going to get easier? And the phrase is, it's never going to get easier, you just get faster. It's always difficult. It's always uncomfortable. And the charge, I think, that Jesus gives us when we see where he goes is he's demonstrating for us a capacity to move into these uncomfortable spaces, not withdraw from them, and still be a transformative presence. Part of that has to do with what he does. So not only does he go somewhere, but next slide we'll go to is, what does Jesus do then when he gets there? If you look at the very first verse 1 and 2 and then 7, it's really interesting to me that he goes in and it says, he notices the religious leaders are watching him closely. And then he notices how the guests are choosing places of honor. In other words, he reads the room. Jesus is demonstrating here this capacity to read the emotional temperature of the room. It would be what we would call having emotional intelligence, right? If you can walk into a room, a space, and actually notice what other people are doing, notice what other people are saying, notice what they're thinking and maybe what they're feeling a little bit, and then responding in kind. I think if there's one skill that any disciple of Jesus should develop, it's emotional intelligence. And if there's one critique maybe of Christians in American society right now, it's that in many ways we lack emotional intelligence. We don't recognize how the room feels, and so when we say things and we do things, we are totally ignorant of how it's actually landing. And so often the words we say land and do the opposite of what we intend, right? Now, you probably know some people in your life that don't have emotional intelligence, right? God bless them. If you know nobody, then it's probably you. When I talk about this, I say it's like the Michael Scott test. If you've ever in an office setting and you're like, who's Jim and Pam and Michael of our office, right? And if you're like, man, I cannot figure out who Michael Scott is, it probably means you're Michael Scott of your office. So same kind of thing with emotional intelligence. But one of the reasons that it's important to develop that is because of another thing that Jesus does, and that is based upon the way that he could read the room, he was then able to ask really good questions, questions that were healing rather than destructive. I'm pretty good at sarcasm. In fact, it's like my superpower, right? And my sarcasm comes out in like a sarcastic question, like, really? Really, Pharisees? Really, you're not going to, heal your son on the Sabbath if he's like in a ditch? Like, really? That's not reading the room. That's not the kind of question that leads to healing. But Jesus does. It's amazing to me that so much of what he does is really just pose questions that are really probing, that don't close off conversation, but actually give rise to more conversation, whether there or ongoingly. These are the kind of questions you can ask when you actually have done the work and taken the time to identify where is everybody in the room. What does it mean? What kind of cares and concerns would a Pharisee bring in that are different than the cares and concerns of someone that's impoverished or suffering from a lifelong illness or any other number of things? That is a capacity that all of us can model after what Jesus does. And when he does that, it's amazing to me because it takes practice. He was very practiced at it, and we can be too. And when we do it, and when we deploy it in ways that are effective, it literally heals people. It's an actual healing mechanism that we can inject into society, but it requires so much work. If we don't do it, though, if we just go in and it's like, I'm not going to worry about reading the room, I'm not going to worry about what others think or feel, all we do is become sarcastic superheroes, or we just end up making super tone-deaf assertions. I don't know if you track with much sort of national Christianity, but there's a lot of times I see Christian leaders or just Christian individuals making assertions that on the face of it are right? They're true, but they're completely tone deaf. They're not recognizing the way those words land in a particular context. But Jesus does. And part of the reason he's able to do that is because, point one, he's going into places that force him to do that. If you never inhabit a space that requires you to think about, maybe not everyone agrees with me here, well, then you'll never develop that capacity, right? So Jesus went time and again into places that challenged his assumptions, and part of his response was to say, okay, what do I do given all the different ways that people see the world in the room that we're in? So he doesn't just go places, he doesn't just do some things. Jesus also says some stuff. And often, if you read the Gospels, Jesus does usually one or two things. Either he asks a question, and it's usually a rhetorical one, or he tells a story. Those are his two primary modes of talking. Sometimes he'll be direct, and that's usually when the disciples are super confused, and they're like, what on earth are you talking about, Jesus? And he's like, all right. And they bring him aside, and he's like, you guys still don't get it, right? You've heard me over and over. Let me explain. But especially in public, it's almost always questions or stories, right? Here is a perfect example. So what he says here comes in the form of these two parables in Luke 14. And the text even refers to it as a parable. He told them a parable. But really, we could see this as kind of like instructions on how to be what I'm calling hostable. So in the first parable, he actually turns to all the guests. And he goes, okay, I'm really glad you're here. And it's really wonderful that you've been invited to this banquet. But I need you to know as you come in, if you're a good guest invited to this banquet, you need to recognize that it's not all about you. Don't walk in as if you own the joint and sit at the head of the table and then assume that everyone's going to organize the rest of the events around you, around the things you care about, the things that you're concerned about, the kind of food that you like. No, come in and assume that it's not about you. We love you, right? We're super glad you're here. That's why we invited you, but it's not actually about you. And maybe you could imagine going to more banquets that aren't about you. Because something might happen to your soul when everything doesn't orient around the things that you care about and the concerns that you bring to the table. So that's parable 1. But then he goes to parable 2, and he turns his gaze to the people that are actually hosting this entire banquet. And he says something that, is kind of counterintuitive, but it really sort of reinforces this thing that I'm talking about as being hostable. And he looks at the hosts, and he says, instead of hosting these banquets where you invite all your rich friends over, invite people that could never attend, or not never attend, but could never pay you back, right? That their attendance doesn't come with some other expectation. Because at the time, in the first century, a thing would happen where really wealthy donors would invite and throw these extravagant parties, and they would invite their other wealthy friends, assuming they were going to be repaid in kind. And back and forth, the invitations would go, and a lot of it was to develop this sort of like a political network, a economic network that they could rely upon. But essentially, over time, the guest list shrinks, and the guest list also becomes more homogenous. It's just a bunch of really well-resourced people virtue signaling to each other. And he says this is not hospitality. Hospitality, if you want to be a host in the way of Jesus, is to invite those who will never be able to pay you back. So he looks at the hosts and says, I'm going to diagnose the problem with you. The problem of you being a bad host isn't that you don't have enough stuff or you haven't thought about the guest list or whatever. The problem is you are a terrible guest because you've never experienced actually being one. So here's my question. Put it up hopefully on the slide here. Oh, after what Jesus says. What if in our attempt to engage the world in which we live and move and have our being, so everywhere outside of these walls, what if we focused our energies, much like the man that we claim to follow, not on being amazing hosts, but on being and becoming hostable? There's, of course, nothing inherently wrong with the instinct to create hospitable spaces for other people. If we were going to say what as a local community, as Vanguard, or the broader church needs to do, we can be better hosts, right? I mean, VBB is just one big celebratory hosting opportunity, right? So expanding the guest list, inviting people, finding out the ways that all the little different micro interactions that happen on a Sunday morning either invite or preclude people from coming. All of that is incredibly important in the way that we act faithfully as disciples in the world. But no way does that amount of hospitality, and in no turn can you actually change the fact that it's still your table. It's still your space, your building. It's still your guest list. It's still your selection of foods, and all the rules operate according to your cares and concerns. So no matter how great you are at being hospitable, it's impossible to ever change that fact. So there's nothing wrong with that kind of hospitality, but we can spend so much time and energy on hosting that we completely forget what it's like to be a guest. And over time, kind of like a muscle that atrophies, we fail to see the ways that often we are really bad guests. Like a bull in a china shop, we kind of blow into these different spaces. We don't even realize ways that we often can do damage to our host and to the other people who are in the space with us. And over time, we completely become blind to the many, many, many tables that we are no longer invited to because we're no longer welcome. Maybe we never were. If the North American church is facing a crisis, I'd put it like this. We are not even aware of how unwelcome we've become. But the gospel is good news. The good news is this. We are disciples of a man who spent his entire life going into other people's homes, sitting at other people's tables, celebrating at other people's parties, The good news is that even though we don't have the opportunity to be the host with the most anywhere and everywhere at all times, in every space we enter, we are called to be hostable. The reason Jesus was able to do that wasn't just because he made killer wine, although that helps. If you can magically produce wine, you will be invited to more parties. I'm not going to, discount that skill set. But the real reason Jesus was able to do this was because at his core, Jesus was hostable. And that kind of guest doesn't just turn on its head pictures that hold us captive about what hospitality means and being a host means. That kind of guest blesses the host, and even more importantly, that kind of guest transforms each and every space that they enter.